of Karlo Basta's The Symbolic State, Minority Recognition, Majority Backlash and Secession in Multinational Countries, published by McGill Queen's University Press. This is I'm really excited about this. This is a brilliant book. And when I read it, I read it with some frustration and sadness. Frustration in part because this is a book I wish had been a year ago when we were drafting our own, because it would have been so tremendously helpful to be able to draw on a lot of its contributions, but also with a tinge of sadness because obviously this is a book that Richard Simeon would have dearly loved to have seen in print. He would have been very, very proud. I'm joined today not just by Karlo, but by four excellent discussants who I'll introduce very briefly. I could say much more about them, but in the interests of time, I'll just limit myself to a few key points. So Erin Jenne is a professor in the Department of IR at the Central European University with research interests in ethnic conflict, nationalism, populism, foreign policy, and research methodology, among others. Siniša Malešević is professor of sociology at University College Dublin. His work ranges across nationalism studies, war and organized violence, empires, ideology, comparative historical sociology, and other topics. Anwen Elias is reader in politics at Aberystwyth University with expertise in regionalism, nationalism, and secession, and has most recently been working on the role of regional and nationalist parties in achieving economic and social justice. And last but not least is Michael Keating, who is Emeritus Professor in Political Science at the University of Aberdeen, founding director of the Centre on Constitutional Change at the University of Edinburgh, and has written widely on a variety of issues related to the topics we'll be discussing today, not least territorial politics and nationalism over a number of decades. In terms of the structure for today, Karlo will be speaking for about 10 minutes, and then we'll turn to each of the discussants for 10 minutes. There'll be a short response from Karlo, and then we'll open it up for question and answer. If you have questions that you'd like to ask, just raise your hand, and the system here will keep track of the order in which people wish to speak, and I will call on people in batches of three. But also, if you're listening to the discussants or to Karlo and you wish to pose a question in the chat, then please feel free to do so, and we'll include those in the questions. But without further ado, I will turn it over to Karlo, who's going to speak to us about his wonderful book.
Ailsa, thank you so much for this kind introduction, and thank you for agreeing to moderate. I mean, I can't really express what a privilege it is, first of all, to be able to to celebrate the publication of the book, but also to do it in the presence of such a fantastic panel, 5 people that frankly I don't think I could have had a better setup here. So and thank you to all of you, and also to all the people who are joining us today. I know it's, first of all, busy part of the semester, and everybody is busy, and I think also everybody's kind of sick and tired of Zoom presentations and things of that nature. So I do appreciate this. I truly do. So what I want to do is provide you with a brief 10-minute summary, give or take, just to set the ground for what our discussants are going to be talking about. This is on the assumption that most people have not had the chance to read the book, and then we'll take it from there. So anyway, I want to just basically start. I suppose you know how they say you can't judge a book by its cover. Well, this particular book you can quite literally read from the cover, particularly the second part of the title. I can't claim that this is my joke. This is Norm Macdonald's, but and it's much funnier coming from him. But at any rate, it was deliberate. Right? I really wanted people to have a good sense of what the argument, broadly speaking, is from that second part of the title. Briefly, it's a book that looks at the political consequences of attempts to accommodate minority nations in 4 multinational states. with emphasis particularly on the link between territorial autonomy and claims for independence or secession. And the four cases are Canada with Quebec. I look at that case from about 1960 to about 1995. I'm looking also at Spain with particular reference to Catalonia from about 78 to give or take 2017. Yugoslavia with emphasis on Croatia also from about 1960 to about 1990, and then finally Czechoslovakia, but for a much briefer period of time from about 1989 to the breakup of the Czech and Slovak Federal Republic in 1993. And so the story is more or less as follows, stylized version, of course. When purported representatives of minority nations make their claim for greater or more expansive self-government, they're in effect doing two things. The first one is they're asking for more powers and resources in order to get things done, achieve greater or faster economic growth, to protect their culture or language perhaps, or even to establish a different or differentiated social policy model. So what I call this side of things, or this particular aspect of these demands, is instrumental, right? Instrumental demands. But simultaneously, these claims are claims for recognition as well. In other words, these claims are about recognition of at least minority, in demographic sense, communities, minority nations in these four cases, a recognition of these nations or communities as nations in their own right. So the claim is for the state to recognize that they're nations, and by extension to recognize that the state itself is a multinational polity rather than a nation state. In other words, that the citizenry of that particular state is not, for all its diversity, essentially comprising a single political community, but that there's a multiplicity of political communities within these states. And I call this the symbolic aspect of these demands. Now, this recognition can take obviously a variety of forms. I focus on the formal organization or reorganization of the state, particularly the territorial dimension, through, for example, as in cases of Canada and Spain, territorial asymmetry. But in addition to these kinds of formal elements of state organization, the symbolic recognition can also take the form of constitutional stamping, right? So either constitutional or quasi-constitutional change that explicitly recognizes that a particular community is a nation, or explicitly recognizes that the state is a multi or plurinational one. So that's the first part of the argument, right? This claim having this dual characteristic, the instrumental and the symbolic aspect. Now, the second part of the argument deals with what happens when the central governments in multinational states, or particularly these multinational states, respond to these demands, right? So what I show in the book is that if central government concedes on instrumental issues, right? So greater policy autonomy, more fiscal resources, for example, the ability, greater ability to raise taxes or increasing spending, without conceding on the symbolic side, then politics, broadly speaking, ought to remain in relative equilibrium. But if the central government combines those instrumental concessions, right, so more power, etc., with the symbolic aspect, it creates conditions for majority backlash. And the reason for this is that a far-reaching symbolic reorganization of the state in response to minority demands, in effect, threatens to undercut the way in which at least a significant segment of the majority population conceives of their collective selves, and the way in which they conceive of the state that they normally tend to identify with. So if this backlash takes the form of open political mobilization and politicized mobilization, drawing in broader masses of the population, mobilization against these minority claims, then three things are likely to happen. First of all, this majority backlash, this politicized majority backlash, demonstrates to members of minority nations beyond doubt that a substantial portion of the population in the rest of the country, a substantial population, in other words, of the majority nation, is simply unwilling to reimagine the state in a more a multinational key, right? And that's important, obviously. The second consequence of this majority backlash is that it increases the chances that those concessions that have been attempted or granted will be either rescinded or reversed. And then the final consequence is that both of these, in effect, weaken the hand of moderates among minorities. In other words, people who are arguing in favor of the continuation of the common state, and strengthens the radicals, the people who wish to see a constitutional breach, secession, independence, etc. So, in other words, it's this process of elevating the expectations among the minority population and then dashing them, right? That I found led to significant and fairly rapid rise in minority support for secession, or secessionist crisis, as I call it here, right? So what I see in 3 of the 4 cases here covers this. So there was really no majority backlash to some fairly far-reaching, fairly important, extensive grants of increasing autonomy or resources to minority regions. But the majority backlash did materialize in response to symbolic recognition, which I argue is both easier to grasp cognitively, but it's also more emotionally evocative, right? And by extension, I also argued that the rise in minority secessionism is not necessarily, or not predominantly due to instrumental losses, but rather is far more about symbolic reversals. So in a nutshell, that's basically the argument. So the key contribution of, the book, I believe the book actually makes a number of contributions, which explains in part the people that are with us today as discussants, because they all cover different elements or angles of what the book does. But I think the key contribution, the one that I wish to foreground, and I think the reason that I think the book should be read, is emphasizing this notion that institutions, yes, are tools or instruments or resources with which we do certain things, but they're also symbols in their own right. They embody, they condense, they express narratives about different identities. And because of this, they are perhaps as important, or maybe for some reasons, more important for what they mean than for what they do. And then the book also shows how this symbolic dimension matters for the fate of multinational states. Although I will say that I believe that the symbolic aspect of institutions is important also in more nationally homogeneous states, but that's for a different discussion. And thus the title, the first part of that title, The Symbolic State. And that's essentially all I have to say. I think this was about 10 minutes, give or take, and I look forward to the comments and questions to come, both from the discussants and from the audience. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks, thanks, Karlo. Erin, would you like to go first?
Okay, sorry about that. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Karlo, for inviting me to speak on your very stimulating book. It was an enjoyable read. I very much enjoyed reading this book, which I thought was so outstanding from a number of points of view. One thing that immediately struck me was the confidence of the tone and the engaging manner of writing, and it makes it at once highly readable and yet also still an important academic work. And his voice is confident, and yet it's also curious. So it comes across as in a kind of pleasingly informal way, and yet it maintains its commitment to these big, the intellectual exercise of asking this important question: how do we account for these demands, and why do they radicalize? I thought also that Karlo engaged with the literature and made some very astute points, and that's a big part of the magic of the book. It's a great skill to have developed at such an early stage in one's career, so Karlo should be commended for such a major achievement. I will confess that I struggled a bit with what to say about the book as it covers so much of the territory that I covered in my also dissertation book entitled Ethnic Bargaining. At times I felt our arguments and findings fit together and other times less so. Also, our account of one of the cases is different, and that is, I think, what happens when people write about the same question with some of the same empirics, and I'll circle back to that later. For now, let me back up and summarize Karlo's question and argument. He first asks why, after minorities received fiscal and economic autonomy from the central government, did the minority representatives not stop with these demands once they were met? Karlo argues that the standard political economy argument for minority claim making fails to pass muster because they fail to account for the many ways that minority claims do not comport with the group's economic interests. Following a symbolic politics approach, in some ways similar to Stuart Kauffman, who I imagine, as well as Anthony Smith, were a major inspiration for the argument, Karlo makes a strong argument against political economy explanations because they, like instrumentalist approaches, neglect the symbolic function and effects of institutions. I think he was making a similar point in his introductory remarks. State institutions are not just decorative symbols, he argues, they are prominent and emotionally evocative. Thus, the state is symbolic, and these symbols embody the often conflicting visions of what kind of state one is inhabiting and what kind of political community it encapsulates. So he then proceeds to lay out his argument in the first few chapters and offers a stylized model that describes the causal processes that looks kind of like an extended game tree, but one without choices. So I spent a lot of time with that. He titles it a causal process summary and looks to me in a way like an action reaction model. And it reminded me a bit of Lenka Bustikova's new book called Extreme Reactions. That might be interesting sort of companion volume to this, because she looks at it from the other side of things. In round one, minority makes instrumental and symbolic demands. When the minority is given autonomy, the minority will not be satisfied with these material concessions if they are not accompanied by a symbolic recognition. This produces minority mobilization, leading to round two, where minority leaders restate their instrumental and symbolic demands, which then leads to more autonomy and symbolic recognition, which that part, the symbolic recognition, leads to a majority backlash, as he described, and that leads us to a secessionist crisis. And what follows after setting out his argument is a very well-designed and executed analysis of 4 cases of autonomous minorities, what he calls claimant governments that yielded secessionist crises. 2 things I thought were outstanding about this book besides the writing and the tone. First, the methodological design was first rate. Karlo did an outstanding job of justifying his scope conditions and method of case selection. This is never easy to do in qualitative research, as qualitative designs are by nature sui generis. And I thought this was very fine. I might even use this as an example in my own mixed methods course as an excellent template for small n case selection. Very, very well done. And what I also thought was great was a careful application of his method of process tracing using George and Bennett's technique, also Beach and Peterson, to apply his work to the empirics of the case studies, identifying both the observable implications of the theories as well as the causal process observations, which are then matched against the hypotheses to assess the explanatory leverage of the theory. He does an outstanding job in setting all this up and executing it without losing the reader. That is not easy to do. The second thing that I thought was really great about the book's framing is, as a theory of multinational states, Karlo is right that we do not actually have a theory in nationalism studies about multinational states. As I was reading the introduction and subsequent chapter on theoretical bottlenecks, I saw that this is a genuine theoretical lacuna in the discipline. In fact, I think this challenge that Karlo makes could be massively extended and broadened to investigate the nature of multinational state identities themselves. How do Swiss, Belgian, Yugoslav, Czechoslovak, British, and even Canadian identities work? Are these fake or thin or simply state identities without much weight that could be easily cast aside? Or are these actual competing national identities in and of themselves that are possibly superordinate to the subnational identities? These sets of questions have never really been systematically addressed, in my opinion. Are they hyphenated or nested hierarchical identities? A lot of social psychologists have explored this layered structure of identities at the individual level using survey research. But how did these identities function together as we scale up into groups and even states? Karlo's book is an important first step in building a new research program in multinational states, and he sketches out what that might look like in this concluding chapter. I liked many more things about the book that I've listed, but in the interest of time, I wanted to throw out a few challenges. So first of all, I did struggle with the division between symbolic and instrumental, both demands and concessions. So there's 4 pieces there. Also, by instrumental, I was struggling a bit there too. I read mostly material demands and concessions. I think it makes sense, as Karlo does, to distinguish window dressing, like the hyphen debate over the Czechoslovak name, from more meaningful concessions like fiscal federalism. But in practice, the symbolic and instrumental really go together. In fact, when it comes to language policy and claims, for example, the two completely intersect. Indeed, David Layton has used game theory and survey data to show empirically that there's a threshold of minority language speakers above which minority members favor minority language instruction and below which they do not, because learning that language is not believed to advantage their kids. In fact, nearly every major minority claim, like cultural, regional, and territorial autonomy, for example, are not just highly emotionally resonant, but also embody concessions that have real meaningful material impacts on people's lives. And so in that sense, they are a kind of integrally interrelated. Relatedly, I was not really convinced that secessionist crises necessarily go in this particular sequence or that they cannot be reversed. Karlo points out that his is not meant to be a general theory of secessionism. However, it should travel to cases that meet the theory's scope conditions. The Flemish, for example, have advanced both symbolic and instrumentalist demands for decades, but never once has this escalated to a secessionist crisis, despite the radically different symbolic institutionalisms on both sides. Montenegro, in the former Yugoslav Republic, received every national symbol that all the other Yugoslav republics received during the Cold War, including a flag, an Academy of Arts and Sciences, their own constitution, and yet the proportion of self-identified Montenegrins actually declined nearly every decade, from a high of 91% in the 1940s to around 45% at the time of independence. Macedonia, meanwhile, had none of those things and yet seceded in 1992, whereas Montenegrins were highly divided on both national identity and secession all the way up until independence. The relationship between the two is highly complex. In fact, minority elites, claimant governments, are highly instrumental with their demands and move them up and down from secession to federalism to autonomy. In response, I would argue, to perceptions of shifting leverage from outside kin states, as I show in my book, in the case of Sudeten Germans in interwar Czechoslovakia, and even internal institutional leverage, as I show in my case study of the Czechoslovak split. In fact, it bears pointing out that the Slovak demands for a state treaty at the end was not symbolic necessarily, and not only a response to rising Slovak nationalism, but also to the fact that the Slovaks had leverage of the Moravian nationalists, who mobilized strongly for a tri-federation in 1990 and also in 1969. So it's actually a longer process, did not. Article 42 in the communist era federal constitution prevented outvoting of the Slovaks by the Czechs. There was no way they were going to give up on this to save the Union. The Slovaks intended to use a minority veto to extract maximal concessions from the Czechs with tragic consequences, as Karlo points out in 1992 and 3. In my interviews with observers and one participant in the negotiations, Charnogorski, it was explained that this was absolutely a bargaining gambit driven by the conviction that the Constitution gave them leverage to continue to attempt concessions from the center. Hence, minority leverage should not be overlooked as a driver of demands. These questions and quibbles that I have, however, do not in any way detract from the quality of this very fine book. Karlo should be congratulated on publishing a truly page-turning and thought-provoking first book on minority claim-making. I will recommend it to all. Thank you.
Wonderful, thanks, Erin. Siniša, do you want to go next?
Yeah, okay. Thanks very much, Karlo, again for inviting me. And as I'm a sort of a black sheep here, being the only sociologist among all these political science, international relations people. So I'll kind of focus a little bit on that kind of sociological angle. I completely agree with Erin. This is really a very, very well written book. It's really elegant and kind of accessible. And it's also very precise. I mean, the arguments are made, convincingly. The case studies are chosen nicely, and it's really enjoyable to read for people outside of political science and comparative politics in general. And I think I agree again with Erin. The contribution that you make is about these kind of mechanisms of for cases, but I think it's even more important that you're mapping and developing a sort of a new field of research that you emphasize, particularly in the beginning of the book, and that's the whole issue of multinational state, which should be approached, I think, as a distinct entity, both from political science angle, but also from sociology angle, which is not your job. That's job perhaps for others in some respect. Although you do engage with sociological literature, I do recognize that. So I want to focus very briefly on three issues. One is this relationship between multinational states, nation states, and nationalism. Another issue is really kind of your key argument about this role of symbols in multinational states. And then if I have time, I'll focus a little bit on the Yugoslav case. I think I have to. So I think you're completely right in a sense that we do live in a world where nation state model is taken as given. So this is a response in many respects on a kind of hegemony of kind of this idea that starts in the 19th century, but really takes global form after the Second World War. So all states in the world today frame themselves as nation states. So you're right completely about multinational states. They have to kind of negotiate this and navigate, but so do the city states, like Singapore or Monaco, or sultanates or emirates, or kind of maybe Japan as a last empire, nominally at least on paper. So I think the way how our world is structured politically, ideologically, it forces states to embrace this nation state framing. So in that sense, I agree with you. The multinational states need analytical apparatus of their own, but they're also, I would apply that to others in the sense, this is an idealized world of homogeneous nation states which don't exist. There is no homogeneous nation state. But what matters really is that nationalism is so pervasive as an ideology that everybody kind of embraces this discourse as an aspiration, if not as a reality. And it was always an aspiration, it was never a reality, in the sense of, only during the particular forms of genocide and things like that. So in a sense, states are complex organizations. Internally, if you probe them, everyone is very different, but they do have some kind of common forms, which are also important for us to study. So I would link this a little bit more to kind of historical context, being historical sociologist. I think you do kind of give us a historical kind of trajectory for all the four cases, and you do emphasize that historical legacies are important. But what I would emphasize, I would go a bit further in a sense. I would go into the kind of all of these states emerge on the ruins of imperial order. So this imperial order was around for 5,000 years. So there are these deep legacies, which have something to do with the character of the state, with the, many things. So I'm thinking, whether we can talk a little bit about these imperial legacies, which you do mention here and there, in different contexts. And all four cases that you talk about are also very much product of empire in different ways. So that's interesting. What's also interesting, and I don't know whether you have written about this in other places, what struck me a little bit is this kind of asymmetry in between the kind of cases like Canada and Czechoslovakia on one hand, when you have a kind of binational arrangements, and when you have Yugoslavia or Soviet Union or Spain, where you have a sort of many groups, and that reminded me straight away, Zimmel's distinction between dyads and triads, and how we do behave differently. The logic, social dynamics is completely different in between the two, between 3 or 4 or 5, and so on. So maybe that could be worth exploring. So now I'll move quickly onto the symbolic element, and I think this is, I think, very important contribution. I agree with you, that political economy is important, but so it is kind of ideas, values, meanings. These are all important, have to be captured, have to be analyzed. However, I wouldn't call them symbolic, I would call them ideological. So I would kind of expand this a little bit more, because symbols obviously are always arbitrary to some extent, and they have to be framed into particular ideological discourses and frames. And so in that sense, I personally don't like the term identity because it means so many things, and it's very, in itself, very ideological. So for me, it is interesting how particular social organizations play with some symbols and why some symbols resonate and others don't resonate. And I think this can be analyzed further from the kind of sociological point of view. You do look, obviously, that's your job as a political science, you look at the political elites, but we could also look at the cultural elites, because they produce symbols, they generate symbols, they kind of create this environment. So, and then the wider society, the civil society. And obviously in sociology, we do have this distinction between the kind of the habitual action, of Billig and Fox and others, of banality, of reproduction and all of that. And then we also have the kind of the active mobilization. So that's the Durkheimian element of the effervescence and what Collins calls time bubbles. Everything explodes suddenly, but it explodes only because you have this habitual thing of reproducing symbols and using them and so on. So for me, it would be also interesting, again, this is my own personal bias, professional bias, moving away from political systems into the direction of societies. And you do touch on this here and there, and societies are complex, and societies reflect these political organizations and parties and movements that ultimately make these decisions. But it is interesting to dig a little bit into the society and see what's really happening internally, and how all these things are reflecting onto the political system. I think what was missing slightly here is the role of geopolitics, in a sense, because all of these states collapse also because there's an external thing there going on, collapse of communism or something, their neighbors which are powerful and things like that. I know this was not your focus, but it would be interesting to see where is the geopolitical element here, what role does it play in all of this? Okay, and the last thing that I want to focus very briefly on is the Yugoslav case, and this is again a very complex and messy history that you deal with, I think, very, very nicely in a very clear way. And but obviously, because your focus is on a Serb-Croat relations, there is a little bit over kind of too much homogeneous presentation of these two entities, if you like. So it's not easy to capture this fluidity and diversity of kind of different political groups emerging. You do that to some extent. You do show how they become radicalized and somehow radicals become more dominant and visible. But there is always that kind of ongoing competition. And I think the position of Croats in Zagreb and Croats in Western Herzegovina and Croats in Vojvodina is always different, and their political movements have to respond to different things. The same as I say with Serbs in Croatia and Serbs in Bosnia and Serbs in Serbia and so on. And that reminded me a little bit of, I know in the last elections in the monarchist Yugoslavia in the 30s, that Bosnian Serb and Bosnian Croats overwhelmingly voted for the peasant coalition, which was led by the Croatian Peasant Party. Obviously, it was in coalition with the Serbian parties, which were against the centralizing Belgrade. So in a sense, you do see here the kind of possibility for an alternative, which is not necessarily ethnically framed, which is an interesting thing. It tells us how flexible these movements can be, and they could go in different directions. So a little bit kind of, I generally, as a sociologist, I don't like this kind of homogenizing things as the Serbs and the Croats and all of that, but I do understand, it's not easy to express yourself. Brubaker does that as well. He criticizes it, but then he uses these terms himself. So I completely understand that. And just the last point to make, it's when you talk about kind of weakening of the state, the Yugoslav state, from particularly from 60s onwards, but the pinnacle of it being the Constitution of 1974. I think you are right in that sense. The federal state was weakening, but there is the other side. There is, so that you could talk about Michael Mann's despotic versus infrastructural power. So the infrastructural power of the state did not weaken. So we have to take that into account. The police, the kind of the courts, the military, the secret police, all of this was expanding. We do have figures of that. You're right in a sense. It became more based in the republics rather in the center, in the federation. But these were ongoing, simultaneous processes, weakening of the federal state, while at the same time strengthening capacity, organizational capacity of the state, which was a good precondition, was ultimately proved preconditions for war, because you could easily use these weapons that were available and these military forces and everything else, paramilitaries, when the wars erupted and everything else. So I would kind of be more flexible, introduce this other variable. So this is like against the Jovic's argument about withering away of the state, which works in the federal context, but not in the sociological sense as the state as an entity. Okay, I'll stop here. I have many other questions and comments which I'll share with you at one point when we meet in person. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Siniša. I had a similar reaction because in a couple different places in the book, you say the defining feature of a multinational state is, and then it's some variation of an absence of consensus over formal institutional arrangements. And to me, I thought, really, is that the defining feature of a multinational state? It sounded like fight and talk to me from the institutionalist corner of things. Right, next up, we have Anwen.
Thank you, Ailsa, and thank you, Karlo, for the opportunity to read and discuss the book, which I've thoroughly appreciated. Like Erin and like Siniša, I thought that this is such a well-written book, very clearly and eloquently expressed. It's really been a joy to read. Like Siniša, I'll start with the observation that you make on the very first page of the book, where you note the assumption that's still prevalent in much of academia, that the modern state is inherently national, and that multinational states are considered to be the artificial or a problem or a crisis to be solved. That starting statement struck a chord with me. I work in a department of international politics with colleagues who are mostly scholars of international relations, and I'm continuously frustrated with their preoccupation with and inability to think beyond the nation state as a core unit of contemporary politics and international politics. And that's in spite of the fact of living in a minority nation in a multinational state. So we start from a common point of frustration, and I very much appreciate therefore your pitch in the book that we need to take more seriously the study and theorization of multinational states. For me, as someone who's coming to the book with a background in territorial politics and a more recent interest in dynamics of secession, I think there are two contributions in the book that I find particularly significant. The first to me is the way you conceptualize the demands made by minority political elites. Now, scholars of territorial politics have expended a lot of effort in developing typologies of the territorial demands made by minority actors in multinational states. And typically these demands are located on a scale according to the degrees of self-government they foresee, ranging typically from limited administrative self-government through to independence at the other end of the scale. The kinds of symbolic demands that you talk about in the book, that is institutional recognition of the minority political community or minority nation, they often feature in such scales towards the lesser self-government end of the scale. That is, the demands that don't typically require major constitutional restructuring or reorganization. And to me, implicit there is an assumption that they're somehow less radical or less dramatic in terms of the kinds of political and constitutional consequences that might come from these demands for recognition. And in the book, you offer a very different conceptualization of territorial demands based on this distinction between instrumental and symbolic demands. And contrary to existing scholarship, I think you show very convincingly that these symbolic demands are indeed potentially very far-reaching in their consequences. And I think you sum up the argument very clearly at the end of your chapter on Czechoslovakia, and I'll quote you. You say, system-threatening conflict in multinational states is more likely to emerge in the realm of symbolic politics than in the instrumental domain. And in this respect, I think the book is a very useful correction to existing scholarship on the territorial demands of minority nationalists, in the way that it highlights the potential political and constitutional significance of these symbolic demands. The second key contribution for me is the way in which you foreground the dynamic interaction between minority and majority nationalist projects, and that this dynamic interaction is the engine of political conflict in multinational states. Now, scholars of territorial politics have long argued that in multinational states, political dynamics have to take into account the reality of multi-level politics, where you have different political actors at different territorial levels interacting with each other. What these same scholars have been much less successful in doing is examining and explaining precisely these dynamics of interaction within multi-level contexts. As you note, most attention has focused on one set of actors in one territorial domain, mostly minority nationalists at the sub-state level, and more recently, majority political actors at the state level. In this respect, I think your book is significant precisely because it takes seriously this dynamic interaction between different actors in multinational states. And again, positioning this dynamic as a central driver of political contestation in such settings. And I think it's only by doing so that you're able to show just how significant the symbolic domain is to political contestation in multinational states. Because you argue quite convincingly that it's precisely at the moment that majority political elites recognize symbolic demands that the risk of majority backlash emerges. And it is this majority backlash that has led to secessionist crisis in the cases that you look at here. So the focus on the dynamic interaction between different actors is very welcome. I think it's especially welcome in relation to the work that has explored the link between autonomy and secession, and which has become somewhat obsessed with showing through quantitative analyses of large data sets that one leads to the other, or not, because these scholars don't agree on the exact nature of the relationship. Again, I think you make the case very successfully that the mere existence of autonomy doesn't bring the countries that you look at to the brink of breakup or beyond. Rather, it's the symbolic politics at stake that triggers secessionist mobilization. And again, there I find the book's argument both necessary and convincing. Let me conclude by reflecting a little bit on how the book's argument has pushed me to rethink some of my own work, which is interested in how secessionist actors frame their calls for the creation of an independent sovereign state. Now here I'm going to go slightly beyond the focus of the book itself, but I think the argument you make about the importance of symbolic politics in multinational states, again, seems to me very relevant and important. So in mapping and explaining the kinds of arguments that secessionists use to make the case for independence, symbolic claims are extremely important, although I have to confess I hadn't really thought of them in those terms until I read your book. In making the case for independence and building popular support for secession, what these actors are doing is crafting what you call in the book a vision of state. It's creating a narrative that tries to map out a new and different kind of state order based on a specific idea of who we are. And crucially, it's a vision of state that is contrasted strongly with that of the central state, and indeed is often rejected by majority political elites for precisely the reason that it is different. In that sense, I can see the symbolic story that you narrate in your book also playing out at a subsequent stage of secessionist mobilization, namely when the secessionist crisis has already materialized and the focus of political contention shifts to arguing for and against the breakup of the state. I wonder, however, if at this stage the symbolic story might also be a bit more complex than the one you describe. Because what our work suggests is that it's often not the case that the vision of state sketched out by secessionists is anchored in the kinds of symbolic demands that your book talks about, that is, a vision of state anchored in a sense of nationhood or national identity. Rather, what we find are attempts at defining the political community based on commitments to shared values such as democracy, equality, fairness, and justice. And that this attempt at formulating a vision of the future state needs to draw on a broader set of symbolic values, because often the citizens you want to appeal to do not necessarily share a sense of identity based on minority nationhood or national identity. So the point I want to conclude with, I guess, is that your argument about the importance of symbolic politics in multinational states is a very convincing one, and one that has implications beyond the specific insights your book provides. But I also wonder whether that symbolic story you map out might also be more nuanced and complex in different phases of political contention in multinational states. So congratulations on an excellent book, but also thank you for pushing me to think about the dynamics of political contention in these kinds of contexts in ways that I haven't done before.
Thanks, Anwen. And last up is Michael.
Thanks, Ailsa. Well, I'd also like to congratulate Karlo on producing this book. I'm also very pleased that he's recently joined our community of scholars of territorial nationalism and territorial politics and nationalism in Edinburgh. I found this book very challenging in the sense that it's trying to engage in very complex issues of conceptualization, at the same time root them in some comparative and political empirical base. Now, unlike most nationalism studies, this is genuinely comparative. It's not just theorizing, it's not just imposing theories on particular places, nor is it just telling stories separately about different places. It's genuinely comparative, and it's comparative of whole cases, which is something that I like doing because it gets generalization and it gets context in at the same time. The conceptualization, of course, is always difficult, and I'm just reflecting on what the others have just said here, because whatever conceptual framework you use, somebody can pick it to pieces, because this conceptualization is all normatively charged one way or another. So I'm not going to criticize you for conceptualization, because I appreciate that is inherently difficult. That is part of the argument itself, and we're never going to get consensus about the correct concepts to use in this field. They're part of the broader argument in itself. But I too just noted your distinction between the instrumental demands, which seem to be about political economy, that is economic development and welfare, and symbolic demands on the other hand, and might question how far that travels and how much analytical leverage you get out of it, however intuitively attractive it might be. You also historicize this, and I like the way that Karlo talks about the creation of the state and the historic legacies and the institutional developments and the path dependency and the way that institutions themselves govern behavior or affect behavior without falling into the trap of institutional determinism. He tries to weave that into the narrative, and then the development of the economy itself. All these elements are there, and so without becoming reductionist, either institutionally or economically reductionist, he weaves these stories together and then shows at what critical junctures things start to really matter. I loved his argument about only looking at relevant cases, not looking for things that are not there, starting a desk with a car key. I've never tried to do that. I can imagine many people who somehow metaphorically do precisely that. And I also like this idea of stages. Nationalism develops in stages, and there's a response from the state, and then the movement itself develops, because that also allows us to explain not only cases, but also non-cases. The null hypothesis is an neglected area in social sciences. When do things not happen when they potentially might happen? And this allows us to do that. And the way the kind of stages argument is a little bit reminiscent of Miroslav Proch's arguments about the development of nationalisms in the 19th century, the way you go from one stage to another. You're perhaps not as mechanistic as Proch tends to be. This is the kind of legacy of his Marxist dialectic. You go one to the other. But this notion of stages is, I think, very interesting. And the first rounds, the centre yields on symbolic grounds and not on substantive ones. I think that is quite useful. And that probably is where symbolism and substance is most useful, not necessarily in relation to the demands, but in relation to state responses. And in Scotland, as you know, it's the other way around. The symbolic concessions were easy and made at a very early stage. And the substantive institutional concessions were made much, much later. In your other cases, it was possibly the other way around. So the states themselves have a whole repertoire of responses, but I think that's a reasonable way to characterize them. But to ask what symbolism is all about, there's a risk, and you don't commit this fallacy, but there is a risk in saying, well, it's trivial because it's just symbols. Because saying just symbols, that's an extraordinary thing to say because people die for symbols. Things are really important. So what is behind symbols? And sometimes it's a claim for power, the really power questions that can be unpicked once you get behind symbols. But above all, it's about the establishment of political community. It's about the construction of what might be called a nation at one stage. And sometimes you go from calling yourself a region to calling yourself a nation or so on. It's really about the ontology of the units in question. And that, of course, is immensely important. That is the most important question of all, really, the boundaries of political community. And you hint at this in various places. I think it'd be useful to put that up front. This is what symbolism is all about. Otherwise, it risks looking like a trivial argument about flags and public holidays and so on, which in themselves, you could say, don't really matter. And then I like your idea of the secession crisis. There's a ratchet effect. That what is the point at which it becomes a crisis? Defining the crisis in the correct way as something, an unsustainable position. So it gives way to a new kinds of politics. Well, going back to this idea of symbolism and political community, again, I think it's about the ontology of nationalism, not the substance of it. It's about the boundaries of political community, which gets us into claims about sovereignty. And once again, we all know sovereignty is a meaningless concept. We all know that. It doesn't mean anything, but it's immensely important. People talk about it the whole time. And even while saying it doesn't matter, people are advancing sovereignty claims. These are really very often claims to recognition. There is much the ontological claim. We are a nation, therefore we will become the subject of self-determination, as defining the object of self-determination, because that is a whole spectrum of things from devolution to complete secession and in an interdependent world and so on. So I think that ontological dimension, you've heard me talk about this before, of course, it really is quite important and it gives some substance to symbolism. And then if one takes the political economy issues, very often they're about the same thing, about the welfare state. Very often that is about creating the community, creating the national community through welfare. Not always, but it sometimes is there. So it's not necessarily a clash between pro-welfare interventionist policies on the one hand and neoliberalism on the other hand. They can be two welfares. And I think your Canadian case illustrates this, two competitive projects for building the welfare state. Who owns the welfare state? Who is the community of solidarity upon which the welfare state rests? And again, this is not just trivial. This is really very important for distributional reasons and about control of resources. And then we get this competitive state building or competitive nation building. And again, Siniša was talking about the nation state, and that's another fiction, which is a fiction, but ubiquitous. It always comes out. So there's sometimes trying to get there, even though we know it doesn't mean anything. And that was really interesting. And apart from the cases you talked about and the combinations you've talked about, what we're seeing at the moment, and I think this is touches on what Anwen has just said, is competitive nation building in both your instrumental side and the symbolic side, although I do somewhat question that distinction, where both sides are competing to exactly the same project. So if you look at the difference between the Labour Party and the Scottish National Party on social and economic issues, they agree on absolutely everything, 99%. There's nothing whatever between them. The question is, what is the level at which you realize that? And having lived in Canada for a long time, I know there was a lot of arguments about this. Who owns these universal values? Because of course they are universal, they don't belong to any nation. But attempt to appropriate these universal values, that's in the realm of symbolic politics, but then it gets into really important questions about welfare and power and definition. And that's what we're going through in the UK at the moment, in the post-Thatcher era, where the issues about the scope of the state, there are radical neoliberals, but they're at the margins of UK politics, and they're state socialists, but they're also at the margins. This kind of welfare capitalism is once again common property, but who owns that project? Who owns the welfare state? What is the nation of welfare? But then, having said that, perhaps we can come back to this symbolic instrumental distinction and ask whether the way that we appreciate how the economy works is not a matter of manipulating symbolic meanings when we talk about the market, the free market, and so on. This is symbolic talk, or when we talk about welfare, the welfare state being an immensely complicated, wicked set of issues there. The shorthand is, well, welfare, we the people, and so on, community solidarity. That's all symbolic. And the practicalities of it are much more messy. So we could in one sense say it's all about symbolism. We know, for example, in the Scottish debate, and Ailsa has looked at this, that it's not so much you calculate the economic benefits and losses and then make up your position about the economy. It's about secession. It's often the other way around. You fit the instrumental arguments around your preconceptions about the level and the nature of the political community. Finally, just something about the multinational state. You're looking for a definition of the multinational state, and that, of course, is a tremendous challenge. Is there a concept or of the nation multinational state, or is the multinational state just an agreement to disagree about the nature of the state? Ailsa says this is fighting talk, and in some sense it is. So we have to agree about that. But do we have to agree? Because for very long periods of time in all these cases, you just don't talk about it. You just agree not to. You agree to disagree, and it doesn't really matter. And this is why I imported into English the Spanish term, the plurinational state, which is not just multinational. The idea is that the concept of nation differs from one part of the state to another. So as long as English people think there's a place called England, Britain, United Kingdom, and there's no difference, it may annoy us up here, but it's in some sense really helpful because they're happy in their identity. And we are happier in our identity up here because we know we've got two and they think they've only got one. But at some point in time, then those understandings may break down, and that's why you've got your problem. So the question really is, do we need a theory of the multinational state, or do we need a theory of coexistence of different conceptions of the nation and the state itself? And that would imply a rather radical reconceptualization of what it's all about, which may be the way forward, because then you're allowing the majorities and the minorities to exist within their own symbolic realms and with their own notions of political community, while getting on with the ordinary business of government, dealing with the welfare and economic issues, because they tend to be in this particular debate some of the easiest issues. You can always split money. You can always redistribute competencies, as long as you don't touch those issues about the nature of the political community, because these are issues upon which in these states you're talking about will never agree.
Okay, thanks, Michael. So Karlo, I think you're going to respond for a few minutes, which gives the rest of us time to jot down some questions that we want to ask. If you are in a library where you're unable to unmute yourself and ask your question, then please feel free to type that into the chat, and we'll pose those to Karlo to answer. But Karlo, would you like to respond to what you've heard today?
Well, first of all, This reminds me, frankly, before my doctoral defense, I was told this is going to be one of the few examples. There's going to be 4 or 5 really smart people going to read your stuff and talk about it for an hour. Enjoy it. It's not going to happen again for a while. So this is precisely how I feel. I feel like almost like a second defense, where this is just amazing, you know, to get this kind of feedback and to get these really fantastic, substantive, meaty challenges, you know, from all of you. Obviously, I don't want to, we could go into detail and it would take another, 40 minutes. So I'm not going to do that. I do want to let other people ask questions to the extent to which they are. And if we have more room, we can engage with more specific ones. But what I did want to perhaps address is something that I think links at least 3, if not 4, of you, which is this notion about the distinction between the symbolic and the instrumental. Right. So I think I can maybe address that in the hope that we can perhaps deal with a few other more specific questions later on. So and by the way, Michael, thank you so much. I was hoping somebody would notice that trying to start your desk with a car key. This was this was deliberately a little kind of. Anyways, so I do take this point, and I think. Michael and Erin were closest in terms of the critique of this of the concept itself, right? I do acknowledge, and I have to say that I was myself struggling with this notion of how to conceive of the distinction between the symbolic and the instrumental dimension of institutions. I think, frankly, you could take anything. Any institution or even any policy and symbolize it, as it were, right? Turn it into something symbolic, technically. So I was myself kind of struggling to figure out whether or not and how I could actually get this down, and if it holds any, if it captures something meaningful, significant, analytically and politically itself. And I think it does. What I want to emphasize, and I think it's in the book, but it's perhaps too deeply buried in the book, is that while almost everything can be symbolized, not everything can be symbolized as easily. So that's the first kind of element, right? So there are, the territorial redistribution formula, for example, or any number of ways in which you organize at multi-level, a social welfare state. This is something that you just mentioned, Michael, right? There's this complex kind of behemoth. Try and symbolize that. Is what I'm trying to get at, right? You can do it, and in certain of these cases, you did have these moments of tension around issues that were decomplexified in a sense and turned into a claim for more money or something like that, right? So so I think everything can be, but not everything can be as easily, right? Symbolized. And not all symbols have the same kind of political weight, right? So I would agree that, for example, language policy or the institutional arrangements around language autonomy are something that comes closest to being both, right? Because on one hand, you're protecting your language, you're making sure that it survives, and in that sense, the institutions are instrumental. But at the same time, this is an expression of who you are as a population. So they're both, absolutely, right? But you can go beyond that, right? In the case of Catalonia, and this is the last of the countries that I went, this notion of the dysfunctionality of the regional transportation system is highly symbolic. It's symbolic of the perceived exploitation of Catalonia by Madrid, et cetera, right? However, and I'm here with following Michael Walzer, I would argue that the state, the institution of the state, is a sort of a meta symbol. Right. And again, this goes back to what Michael was talking about. It's about this kind of broad organization of what is kind of in nationalist discourses normally foregrounded as this symbol of symbols, right? This ultimate kind of roof under which everything else kind of happens, right? So what I didn't find was the mobilization. Certainly there was mobilization around particular policies, but I didn't find this massive backlash to changes in any of these other areas other than the reconstitution, the symbolic reimagining of the state itself. And I should say, incidentally, Michael, I really like this this idea that the multinational state is in fact a disagreement, and that's what makes it what it is, right? Now, I wasn't trying to define, I should say, multinational state, but to conceptualize it, right? And I'm not completely happy with the conceptualization, which is why I take the point that, is this really what makes multinational states distinguished or distinct from nation states? Not completely entirely happy, but I do think that the book captures this notion that there's something about the formal organization of the state that is a kind of symbol above other symbols, right? Again, obviously, this is something that we can argue about and maybe push in different directions, but I think that that's one thing where I'm kind of willing to go, no, I think there's something here, right? Now, my apologies, and I think I'll stop here because we're already at 10 minutes past 4, and I do want to see if we have anybody who wants to ask any other questions, and we can maybe go back to some of these issues. Thank you so much, everybody. This was fantastic.
Great, thanks, Karlo. Right, does anyone have any questions they would like to pose? I'll take them in batches of 3, and then just to keep things moving along.
That's assuming they come in batches of 3, right?
They'll come.
Okay, right.
Okay, I was gonna just jump in and say, because I've got loads, so if no one wants, I will just use the hour to just throw them all at Karlo, but we've got one, right. Nicholas, would you like to ask a question?
I'd like to do that. Yes, thank you very much. And thank you, Karlo, for this very interesting book. I really look forward to reading it. And I must say that I really enjoyed the conversation thus far. May I ask a question that I think haven't been touched upon yet by the commentators, and that relates to the kind of, I think Michael raised the question or raised the issue of comparison, and that is a way for kind of, making context specific and maybe meaningful generalizations. And since your cases are, you draw from cases from Canada and cases within the EU in Europe and outside of the EU in Europe. My question is related to whether you have spotted anything in your kind of, the case analysis and the comparative work that you've done that would highlight the meaning of Europe in these cases. Obviously, that is not necessarily central to Quebec, but maybe it is for, kind of making meaningful comparison or making sense to, claims of secession or independence in Quebec, kind of pointing to the connections with French or other ways of kind of doing politics that would separate Quebec from Canada or the rest of North America. Are there, so this is the case, and I think that maybe relates to also what Michael said in terms of the kind of the boundary drawings of political communities, but also something that I think it was Anwen who kind of touched upon the aspect of many of these kind of secessionist movements are trying to advance their claims not necessarily on the issue of nationhood or kind of, we are a nation, therefore we need to be independent, but also in the sense of kind of we can perfect our union, our democracy, or whatever it is that we want to do if we become independent, and that we share with others in, for instance, Europe or anywhere where human rights and democracy and that kind of stuff is shared and promoted. So, but my question is really basically kind of, have you spotted anything in your cases that kind of would signal to us that Europe is meaningful as a way of kind of presenting these claims or advance or just add to these dynamics that you have studied? Thank you very much. And as I said, I really look forward to reading your book.
Thank you so much. Ailsa, do you have another one or should we?
Well, given the pace at which they're coming in, why don't you respond to that one?
Okay.
And then this gives time for others to come up with one. And then I've got some on deck. So
perfect. So Nicholas, thank you so much for the question. This is the easy answer is absolutely yes. And off the top of my head, as you were talking about this, I mean, I could, so at the very least, in the case of Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia, in Slovenian and Croat claims, the role of Europe or joining or rejoining Europe, particularly against what was being portrayed as the state that was basically holding back progress on a number of issues, certainly played a part. In Czechoslovakia, what was really interesting was that it was kind of reversed or inverted, I should say, where it was really the Czech elites, in effect, were, and this is something that Erin rightly flagged, which was that as a consequence of the constitutional framework that democratic Czechoslovakia inherited from the communist period, basically, you saw this gridlock, right? There was this veto power that the Slovaks and the Czechs themselves could kind of exercise. And so what was happening was that as the Slovaks were basically seeking to hold up economic reform, the patience on the Czech side was running out. And part of the justification for the impatience and for the breach, ultimately, for the decision that was made by Klaus to essentially, call it quits on Czechoslovakia, was in part so that there could be this faster rejoining of Europe, so that there wouldn't be this kind of Slovak quote unquote ballast, right? But I do, as a broader point, want to say that one of the major, I guess, omissions in the book, and this is something that Erin and I exchanged a couple of emails a couple of weeks back, was precisely the absence of this international dimension. But it's also reflected in something that that other discussants were mentioning, which is insufficient attention to the sub-state dimension, but also sub quote unquote group. And again, I take Sinisha's point and Brubaker's point seriously here. Of course, group talk is itself an ideological construct, right? The book misses this international dimension and its effect on the dynamics, right? And I would have to think a little bit more about how that might actually be included formally in the argument that I'm making, and whether or not it undercuts the argument. But there's also this understanding that obviously majority nation, whatever that is a far more differentiated thing or process than what the book suggests. However, I will also say that this is something that was a deliberate decision on my behalf, because I wanted to write a book that was as short as possible, precisely in order so it could be what all of the discussants were saying, so it could be readable. And of course, there's a trade-off there. I was asked in Ottawa last week, or one of the podcasts that I did, where are personalities, right? Where are people here? Where are individuals? There's very few if you look at the book, right? They are in the stuff that didn't make it into the book. They're in all the interviews, in all the historical material that I went through, in all the archival work that actually didn't make it into the book. But if, I tried to shorten the book to as short as it could be, and I ended up settling on 180 pages. I wish it could have been 140, but that would have been really going too far.
Okay. Other questions? Can I abuse my position as chair and ask you a question? Right.
Please.
So correct me if I've misunderstood what your argument is, but my understanding is that you're claiming that you get these initial claims or demands, and that if those claims are successful, that then on the one hand gives confidence to the majority nation to then make successive claims, but also runs the risk of a backlash in the majority population or in the majority nation, and that how that operates depends in part on the left-right alignment of those two groups, whether you have a minority government, which institution it is you're talking about, and whether the demands are symbolic or instrumental. So that seems to be what you're saying. So my question is about the majority aspect of that, and it's particularly around the issue of a majority backlash. And you won't be surprised that I was interested in what you were saying about England, right? When you're talking in the back end about, here are my cases, but now let's look at how this might translate as we move across. And of course, I think we have seen a backlash. So my question is, what determines the timing and the extent or the form of the majority backlash? Is it the extent, like if we're talking in terms of a left-right alignment, is it the extent of the gap? And to left-right alignment, I would also say perceived cultural distance there. in terms of kind of a more sociological element to it? Is it the extent of the gap, or is it the degree of asymmetry between those two groups within the population? And then kind of related to that one, I think this book is really important for a number of different reasons, but I think it's important in part because it is a major move beyond what has been a fairly anemic literature on majority nationalism to date. And so I was wondering, and I have never quite been able to put my finger on what it is that doesn't seem to be quite so particularly satisfying about the majority nationalism literature. And I was wondering, from your perspective, what is the problem with the majority nationalism literature? Is it that it's asking the wrong questions, or is it that it's coming up with the wrong answers? So I'll leave that. I see there is one raised hand, but also I've got a private message that there's a question as well available. So shall I turn that over to you, and then
let me. So I have to think through this. So there's the left-right one. It essentially kind of relates to that first part of the story, the political economy story, which I just found ultimately kind of not unsatisfying. It kind of answered a part of the question, which was the part on, what happens with that kind of fiscal autonomy or economic autonomy claim ultimately. And I think the way in which I answered that is reasonably satisfactory. I'm not too happy with it. And the reason that I'm not too happy with it is precisely why I went in this direction of the symbolic stuff. In terms of timing, this is where I think the UK example is in many ways an exception. But it's also one of the reasons that I did not include the UK, right? And I kind of mentioned that at the very kind of, as you said, at the tail end of it. But I think there's potential for this to materialize in the future, and this links to a degree with your work. So the way in which I conceptualize that backlash is not in let's say, simply in the resentment, right? The rising levels of resentment of majority population towards the kinds of concessions granted, right? But also the politicization. So the open and explicit politicization around that. And the way in which I see that playing out in the UK right now would be that resentment is still kind of a sport rather than a political program. And the interesting thing is that I think the way the political program was Brexit, which was oddly enough for most multinational states actually kind of outward looking, which you know better than I do. But I think if we end up having some sort of attempt at far-reaching constitutional reform in the UK, in light of the resentment that you've documented quite well over the past 10 years in England, I think it's at that particular point, because what it would require, any sort of far-reaching constitutional reform in the UK context, let's assume that it's possible. Let's say Labour goes the way of Mulrooney, and they decide that the way back to power is through recouping some of their Scottish seats. And let's say that they listen to the Scottish Fabians and go, okay, well, what we need to do is, depending on what happens with Gordon Brown's report, that we need to recast the constitutional framework, not necessarily in the federal direction, but it's some sort of direction that's going to require rearranging Westminster and rearranging England, right? If that was to happen, that would be precisely that sort of moment where you're asking the majority population to kind of shift the way in which they think of themselves in the name of satisfying the minority population. And I think that might produce precisely the kind of backlash that I'm talking about here, where the Tories potentially would be, it would be just too low hanging a fruit for them to pass it up. And I think in that context, you would probably see, I can't see any kind of reform taking place without a referendum, in England included, that it would be a failed attempt. And I think at that particular point, there would be a qualitative change. If I'm right, there would be a qualitative change in politics in Scotland. Does that answer the question? So, that's how I've been thinking about this, whether or not and what this says about the UK case. On the flip side, if I'm right, and I'm taking my pointers here from Kenneth Dyson, who's written this book about kind of the meaning of state way back in, I think, early 1980s. And he's basically saying that there's something fundamentally different about the way in which the state is conceived of in the UK vis-a-vis continental Europe, for all its differences, right? And you sort of see that in kind of the English attitude towards the UK overall, right? Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know.
Thanks, Karlo. Right, we've got 3 now up and ready to ask questions. So first up, I have Erin, and then Zoran, and then Nicola.
I'll make I'll make mine brief because I've already spoken. This is not to put you on the spot, but I think you know Yugoslav cases very well, so I think this will put you on the spot. But have you thought about how your theory applies to North Macedonia? Because, right, you have the beginning, you have actually symbolic demands, not really on the part of Albanian minority leaders, not necessarily instrumental demands. And if you think about it, the Ohrid Agreement in 2001, excuse me, they implemented your suggestion in a very important way, in the sense that they decentralized. Right, this is at the behest of the EU and NATO, and with the US in the lead. You know, they under the Ohrid Agreement, they decentralized the state, basically gave the Albanian minority regional autonomy through the back door, and also the right to make language policy in regions where the minority exceeds 20%, which of course these are very specific you know, districts in Macedonia at the time that met that criteria. And so there's no actual position for Albanians in the Ohrid Agreement. It was all kind of done in this very sort of boring technical institutional way, which seems to be what you're suggesting. And it seems to have worked, except for the way that it was implemented basically gave so much power, right, to you know, Ahmadi, who and then you know, later other Albanian leaders who had actually been a guerrilla leader, to engage in clientelism on both sides. So these quota systems that were put into place were absolutely ended up being ethnic clientelist you know, configurations. And so you think that you resolve the problems or avoid the problems of backlash that way, but they still somehow gets around to the same sort of solution, because essentially it was a power sharing agreement.
Right.
So clever a little bit too much by half. And you could say, following your argument, that, you know, Gruevski and the Skopje 2014 project was a piece of the majority backlash to that. That fits your argument, but then there's no claims for secessionism in the end. And then now what's incredible is that the whole Macedonian Albanian cleavage has completely been overshadowed by, you know, the conflicts between North Macedonia and Greece and Bulgaria, right? So this shows how a changing geopolitical environment can completely remake the entire kind of like claim-making setting.
Right, and this is fantastic. And I'm sorry that I didn't actually engage with your earlier question about others in, you know, Montenegro as well, right, in the context of the Yugoslav case. For this particular one, I think there's something, you put your finger on something that I've been kind of toying around, perhaps writing something like a standalone thing about, which is this notion that any particular, let's say, quote unquote, instrumental issue, protection, right, advancement of material interests and things of that nature, can be solved in a myriad different kinds of ways, right? So you can have local autonomy, you can have partial regional autonomy, you can have some sort of federal, you know, there's just so many ways in which you can kind of crisscross and cut this kind of stuff. And I think it's precisely what you just said, which is that if you can sort of, and by the way, it's relevant to Ukraine as well, right? Because, you know, you mentioned federalism in that context, and on the Ukrainian side, it's going to be, what are you talking about, right? However, some sort of regional autonomy, I don't know, again, it's kind of, how do you call it as well? What does it look like on a map, quite literally sometimes, right? And this is something that Neil Loizides kind of wrote in his, how do you kind of creatively advance certain kinds of solutions to particular kinds of problems. And I think if you can do that with things that are kind of innocent, right, to attempts to politicize them, you might avoid majority backlash, but also provided that whoever is doing the concession knows that they can control their side, right? So oftentimes people ask me, so what are you saying? What's your recommendation, right? Is it that there should be no symbolic concessions? I'm saying, well, either A, it's better to not concede on symbolic side and maybe concede on the instrumental side than to concede and then take it away. Or if you're going to concede, because you've now been, your back is against a wall, if you're going to concede, make sure that you have buy-in from all the relevant actors on the majority side. Except, of course, you can't know that, right? Especially if you have highly competitive political kind of situation. So I would argue in that particular case of North Macedonia with the Albanian a question, it would be kind of like a case in between, right? Because it's this thing that can be interpreted as symbolically relevant, and yet it was, like you said, very kind of cleverly arranged. Do you really have open kind of backlash? And then that ties into the strategic angle or side of things because of the foreign presence in Macedonia, right? So the case itself is in that particular sense incomparable to a Yugoslavia in 1988 or something like that, right? So do you see what I mean? I completely, yeah. But I think that symbolic bit is there, and you see it in the Greek Macedonian. I mean, come on, right? Really, Macedonia is a territorial threat to Greece.
All symbolic politics when it comes to the Greece, North Macedonia, and Bulgaria.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I mean, I'm sure we would all love to be in the same room having this conversation, but one of the nice benefits of this being online, of course, is that you get participants who are spread throughout the world. So with the next question then is Zoran.
Even hailing from the Northern Pole. So hi, everybody. Ailsa gets the joke. So Karlo, I feel compelled to go a bit meta on you. I mean, you're absolutely prepared for that. But one thing that kind of, piqued my, drew my attention is the expression that you used, symbolic imagination or reimagination of the state. So I have two questions about that. The first question is, what's fit for reimagination of the state? So surely you must mean something a bit more concrete. What comes to my mind immediately, actually, is the imagination, the conception, the metaphorics of territory, right? So sub-state nationalists, secessionists in particular, tend to imagine the federal territory as well, if not as a movie ticket where their own little unit is a coupon, so you tear it down along the perforated line, right? So which makes it nice and neat and orderly, unlike the national territory, which is integral and which is fleshy and meaty. So if you want to secede from that kind of territory, then you need to carve out the chunk of, land, and that hurts, and it's awful because, it's an incision into that entity. So, one thing that comes to my mind is the question of, is the aspect of statehood, which is, obvious territorial aspect, but maybe you can extemporize on what else is there to be reimagined. And the second question has to do with the symbolical imagination of the territory, which is kind of interesting because, how to put it straightforwardly, if you're insisting on symbolical reimagination or the capability of these actors to reimagine or imagine state as a symbol, then I think what you owe us all is an understanding of what is a symbol, which goes back to the initial question of the difference between instrumental and symbolical. So what is a symbol to you? So maybe, I don't know how helpful would this be, from the perspective from which you are engaging these issues. But to me, a symbol is something that compresses different kinds of things, which is difficult, number one. Number two, which is difficult to disentangle. And number three, which is more or less arbitrary. So a dollar sign is an S with two lines. Well, it could be a D sign with a vertical, with a horizontal line. Is that really the case when it comes to territorial politics and multinational states? Union Jack is a composite that you can kind of disentangle into the component flag. So I'm not really sure whether that analogy works there. but even more so, that's the reason to get more clarity on your understanding of symbols to begin with. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So yes, meaty questions, as it were. You're absolutely right. So in the book, I am, to answer your first question, what is being reimagined or re-articulated, right? You can, different kinds of synonyms for this. And I would say, yes, it is territory in this particular sense, but it is the way in which the territory is being. I mean, last 2 weeks I've been teaching this to my undergrad and grad courses about unproblematized versus problematized territory, right? So it's a story of legitimacy. It's a story of legitimacy in which let's say, if you want to call it a nation state, which is aspirational, but some are closer to achieving that aspiration than others, in which no matter what happens on the political battlefield, and that political battlefield can be literally actual battlefield. So imagine Colombia, right, having a 50-year-long civil war with zones of influence of government versus rebels, and yet at no point does it occur to anybody to say, why don't we just, like if you were in a relationship where two people are literally beating each other up for 20 years, wouldn't you at some point go, well, why don't we just divorce, right? But it doesn't happen in a Colombia or in a bunch of other places. You can have anything up to a decades-long civil war where it does not even occur to anybody to kind of basically, as you said, make the incision. Whereas in the context of a multinational state, that's clearly not the case. And it is the traveling of a state from something that is more along the lines of what I just described to the notion where the territorial container or whatever lines you draw within it are more conditional, that makes it, I would guess, a multinational state, which goes back to the idea about conceptualizing rather than defining. So I think I can only offer stories and metaphors rather than a definition of what a multinational state actually is, right? In terms of symbols, I was tempted for the book to define this in some level of detail, but I basically satisfied myself by chucking it into a footnote and saying, okay, here are people who talk about symbols. They're better than me at defining this, but in effect, the symbol is a stand-in for something else. So you can have folkloric symbols, or I call them kind of folkloric symbols, which are your flags, your anthems, your monuments, whatever. They don't really perform a function other than to signify what they're signifying, right? Whereas institutions in this particular case, and that's my focus on them, do other things. And this goes again back to the understanding of this distinction between instrumental and symbolic aspect of institutions. So an institution does also do other things. It privileges some at the expense of others. It achieves certain kinds of things, but simultaneously it expresses, as you said, it condenses, and this is something that I want to emphasize, and that's what I'm talking about symbols. It condenses something far more elaborate, and this goes back to Sinisha's point, which is the question about why symbols rather than ideologies, because these are the nodes of ideology. These symbols are nodes of ideology. Right. And again, going back to the point that I made earlier, the state and the way in which you kind of carve out the state, how you organize the central government, whether or not you have these units that are formally, symmetrical or asymmetric. This is that condensation, in effect, of those narratives or ideologies, if you will, to be more kind of analytically precise, that I'm kind of emphasizing. Sure.
Okay, Nicola.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much, Karlo. This has been a really interesting session, and I haven't had the opportunity to read your book yet. It's on order, but I'm really looking forward to it. Congratulations. And I love the fact that you have designed it to be accessible and widely read, and I think that's great. I wanted to pick up on something thought-provoking that Anwen said, as Anwen often says thought-provoking things, but in relation to the sort of widely used territorial scales within the literature, and I have been uncomfortable with these scales too, but at the other end, so my discomfort has been where they sort of end up with independence without unpacking what that means and the many manifestations that that might have. But Anwen's point was more that the symbolic element is seen on those scales as a lesser thing. And I suppose I hadn't really thought about that before, because the lesser nature of it was that concessions, symbolic concessions, don't require major constitutional upheaval. They don't require restructuring of the state. And so it's lesser, it seems to be lesser in that sense. But can you maybe say a little bit more about the way that you've depicted it in your sort of alternative conception of it in relation to that sort of lesser sense? Is the argument that actually making these symbolic concessions in a way that doesn't result in majority backlash is a major undertaking in itself? And what does that tell us about the state approaches to these things? Because they tend to be accommodation of territorial minorities and changes at the point, changes in the relationship between the state and the territorial minority, whereas is your argument in a sense that actually a lot of the energy should be on bringing the majority community around to this sort of symbolic reconceptualization of the state?
That's fantastic. So, I mean, as you were asking the question, I had different kinds of answers. I want to get to the one that's not necessarily, that I didn't want to foreground, but I'll forget it if I don't, if I don't answer. And I want to latch on to something you said. What if, that, when you mentioned, and again, this is something that I think Anwen also mentioned, that it's relatively easy to make some sort of symbolic concession. I would say that that's precisely the point. If it's easy, then there's an awareness among people on the minority side or claimant side, if you want to be more precise. If it's easy, then it doesn't really matter. So, for example, was it 2005 recognition of Quebecois as a nation by the Canadian Parliament? It was, and not only was it relatively easy to achieve, it also explicitly, people who passed it were explicitly arguing that it did not have much of a meaning. Right. And the reason that it was framed in a way in which it was framed, so it wasn't Quebec, it was Quebecois, because they were saying, oh, that's merely sociological definition, so that doesn't have constitutional meaning. Of course, that is heard on the other side. So if you do that, what are you really saying to us? You're basically throwing us a bone. So it doesn't really matter. So I would argue that those kinds of concessions on the symbolic side have to be signaled as weighty and important. And this is where I'm I think the book isn't precise enough about the notion that perhaps there's something different. There's a key difference between institutional and constitutional kind of recognition, right? And I think there's a kind of continuum between those two. But I think the constitutional might make it more politically relevant among minority nations, but by the same token, it makes it more difficult to swallow on the other side, precisely for that reason, right? So now, whether the question is whether the majorities should accept that or not, I mean, that's not on, I'm not a political philosopher, right? But I think that's where the crux of the matter actually is. I hope that's clear, right? But I do want to kind of extend this to the answer to the first part, the more general part of your question about the kind of role of symbols. And that has to do with the language that I'm using in the book. So in the original formulation, I was distinguishing between symbolic and substantive concessions. And then I was thinking, hang on a second, but that implies that symbols are not substance, they're not substantive. Again, this goes to something that Michael was talking about. Of course, that's wrong. Of course, that's the software. Symbols are the software. You can't really make sense of any of the other claims about resources. And you know this, you've written about social policy, right? There's no making sense of differentiated social policy regimes unless you have this symbolic understanding that this is a state with multiple political communities, each of which has the right to, et cetera, right? So I basically was saying, if I am saying that the distinctions between symbols and substance, then I am adding that adjective that normally goes with symbol, which is mere symbol, right? When people talk about symbols in press, etc., they tend to say, oh, it's a mere symbol. Of course, there's nothing mere about symbols, and that's the whole point of this book, right?
Perfect. Thanks, Karlo. Right. So we have no questions on deck, but I'm wondering if our discussants want to respond to anything that they've heard in the last little while. Or Karlo, if you wanted to take advantage of the time to respond in greater depth to any of the discussant comments, because I know you really restricted yourself in terms of how much you felt able to say earlier on.
Is there, yeah, I mean, I'm happy to kind of defer, but I think I basically tried to pull out a couple of themes from the questions, the original questions as I was answering these. Yeah. Let's see. Right, there was an issue that I wanted to kind of touch on, and it's in response to what Siniša was saying. And it was about this understanding of and I touched upon it in one of the answers, of differentiation in terms of attitudes towards the state, right, among different segments of what I kind of call, and I kind of reify, majorities, minorities, et cetera, right? So absolutely a point well taken, but I think it travels beyond that, and that's something that I kind of foreground in the concluding chapter of the book. And that's, in a sense, also why I'm so tentative about making claims about how far that specific kind of dynamic that I describe in the book, how far I see it traveling beyond those four cases or cases similar to it. And that is this notion that I kind of expect there to be a variation in the way in which the state is perceived, both by cultural elites, and that's something that Siniša talked about, and populations in general, across time, across space, and across social networks. And that, in effect, is kind of why I confine myself, because I don't see why, in the context of second half of 20th and first couple of decades of 21st century, that people who inhabit countries like Spain or even Canada or what used to be Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia, why you would expect that the symbolic baggage that the state comes with would be the same kind of symbolic baggage that you're going to find in, I don't know, 19th century Austria-Hungary or mid 20th century Egypt or the indigenous population of Bolivia, for example, right? So I think, and that's my next project in effect. So the answer to Sinisha's kind of push in this direction is, I'm getting there, but that's the next kind of, or the project beyond the next project. This kind of notion about the differentiation and variation in state meaning, not only among political elites or legal elites, right, but also among cultural elites and population more broadly.
Okay, thanks. So we've got a question in the chat from Adrian. It's a question about metrics, which is great to see. So what are the best indicators for capturing symbolic escalation of disputes versus substantive escalation of disputes?
So this is kind of, I basically looked at, and Erin, I think, did a great job differentiating between the demands in the symbolic and the instrumental domain and the accommodation of demands in symbolic and instrumental domain. So what I basically tried to see was, first of all, how the relevant actors talk about the kinds of claims that they're making. I actually have this PowerPoint presentation, but it's kind of late in the game, so I don't want to even try, sharing that document. But you sort of have this in the book, and it's kind of captured in the way in which certain kinds of issues are talked about. So, for example, in the case of the demands by the Catalan political elites in the early 2000s, they're basically saying, okay, well, here's a number of issues that we're asking. We're asking for a distinctive legal system. We're asking for primacy of Catalan language in educational system, and we want this kind of a fiscal deal. In addition to that, we also want recognition of Catalonia as a nation, right? And so they wrote the entire. So I basically conceptually differentiated between the first set of factors, bearing in mind what we talked about earlier in terms of the language, that it can be both of those things. And then the claim that was being made for national status. So several of the issues that you kind of see with that in terms of the responses is what kinds of things people who are leading the backlash were latching on. And I also looked at the surveys of the era to look at which elements of that particular package of accommodation proved to be most contentious among the population that was being surveyed. And invariably, it would be the symbolic angles. And you can actually see the same thing in Quebec. There were surveys also conducted in late 1980s and early 1990s. And for a majority of people in Canada outside of Quebec, the most contentious element of the Meech Lake package, which contained both instrumental, however you want to conceive of those, and symbolic demands, symbolic demand being recognition of Quebec as distinct society. It was that distinct society bit that proved to be the most contentious, right? And it was the most narrated in Quebec media as well, right? It wasn't the only factor, but it was definitely there. So I hope that addresses the question.
Other questions?
I think Adrian was telling us that he's in a public place and can't unmute himself. So.
Yeah, that's
all right.
Yeah.
Do you have a follow-up, Adrian, or was that okay? All right.
There's clapping from Siniša. So you must have. You
I think the
must have
question
hit
was
something.
about measurement. How do you measure these things?
Right. So I don't measure them. I assess them, I would say, right? And that's kind of the whole point, right? It's a clearly and unabashedly a qualitative book, but we can, of course, challenge the way in which I distinguish, right, between these two.
I was reading it thinking, how would you design metrics to test it? And how would you know when it was happening? How would you know when you were there? How would you know when you'd escaped it happening? That kind of stuff. Sinisha has a question.
Yeah. Sorry, I was struggling with these symbols. Which ones are for raising hand? It is interesting for me. You don't really make much of the kind of difference between the authoritarian and democratic federations. In a sense, particularly partocracies, and you do show this obviously, particularly with the Yugoslav case, but also with the Czechoslovak case. This struggle takes place within the party in a sense. So you end up essentially with these multi-party struggles despite the single party rule. But still, in a kind of democratic context, you do have a civil society, you do have many more pressure groups, which are much stronger, much more visible and things like that. So this must have some impact, obviously, in the long term. So that's one side. The other side, and you mentioned already Colombia and other cases, where there are no kind of major ethnic issues to build around for separatist movement. But this obviously can change. And I'm thinking now, of possibly non-ethnic federations. Some are very stable, like Germany and Austria. But what about US in the long term? There is very much instability there, which is not ethnically framed. I mean, it is in part, obviously, race and everything else, but it's deeply ideological. And, is there a possibility for separatist movement along these lines?
Right. I mean, that's a fantastic question. This is the question I'm asking. I have at University of Edinburgh, there's quite a substantial proportion of American student body, right? And I have them in my class on multinational states. And so I already got that kind of question. I was like, well, and my answer to you is precisely the answer that I gave to them, which is, I don't know, but I hope that they'll be writing about it. Obviously, and this is a supremely sociological question, I think. First of all, can you actually go from a multinational state to a nationally integrated state, right? And I think one of the few examples, depending on how you conceive of the US, antebellum US, and what civil war in the US was all about, if you conceive of it as a nationalist conflict, like is every secessionist conflict also a nationalist conflict? Then you could argue that it was a binational state, at least, that ended up being integrated as a nation state. Can it be unintegrated? I think is an open question. But also, it's a question for other parts of the world. And some of the ones that I've been thinking about, but there's way more beyond the West, are, of course, Bavaria and Germany, and where I'm going in a couple of weeks, hopefully, unless I get COVID, Sicily, right, in Italy. Right. So these are questions that I'm really interested in. I don't think the book really can provide an answer to them, but I think this is, to the extent to which we don't really have answers to some of those questions that I identified in the second chapter. Right, what are the gaps? That's one of the gaps. Right, that's one of the gaps. How do you get this type of entity that, for the sake of this book, I call the multinational state? Right. In terms of the first question. This was, because it was very, very tempting to just lose Yugoslavia and focus on established democratic multi-party systems. But I figured, and I always like to make things more difficult for myself. I figured, let's see if the dynamic that I'm kind of postulating here, if it actually holds in a, I guess you could call it sort of authoritarian polyarchy, right? Because ultimately, especially after 1966, but arguably even before that, you have alternate sources of political power. And Dan Jovic talks about, why that's the case. I think mostly convincingly, it's a deliberate policy to essentially multiply poles of political power. So what was interesting to me as I was doing research in Spain was I heard narratives and kind of identified processes that were eerily similar. Now, of course, the outcomes of those processes were very different for a number of reasons, including, as you say, I guess the regime type, but also political economy, and also global position, right? If you're integrated within NATO, within European Union, within the Euro, things are very, very different, right? And I'll be kind of dealing with that in other research, forthcoming research. But I think ultimately what I said to myself was, okay, let's see if this actually holds any water, this kind of the little snail kind of, the process that I'm looking at. And I was happy that it did, although you can push and say, well, hang on a second. I mean, didn't the sort of backlash take very long to materialize? Would it have materialized sooner, right? Before round 2, had there been a multi-party system? Arguably, yes. But again, I mean, this is one of those things that, I don't think there's a satisfactory answer, and I'm not really sure that there can be one. But overall, I think that given that I was able to tell that story and show that it's fairly similar in terms of political dynamics in an authoritarian, soft authoritarian regime and multi-party ones, I think it's quite convincing.
Okay, Adrian's responded to your previous question about whether you had in fact answered his question, and is saying yes, although he thinks it would help to delineate symbolic practices a priori and then connect them to
fair point.
Outcomes. So I'm conscious of time. I think we've got time for one question more, and Michael has his hand up, so he gets the privilege of asking the last question of the day. Michael.
Okay, I'm glad it's the last question because it's really a thoroughly destructive or deconstructive question about what it's all about. It's that we're all here and we're all complicit in this. We use these terms about nation and state and territory and so on. We problematize them, of course. We're not naive, but we do use that vocabulary. That's our framing of these particular segmental conflicts. But there's a very interesting book by Joseph Marco came out a year or two ago, in which, writing from a legal normative perspective, he says, well, why do we do that? Well, there are all kinds of segmental conflicts there. There are all kinds of claims that are deserving of recognition. And why is it we give these national, political, territorial ones some implicit precedence, not only analytically, but also normatively as well? I thought that was a very good point. I know we have to divide up the discipline, and I know you're not going to answer it. And I think that question is aimed at all of us. Certainly not you, Karlo, but it's an interesting question. Once you widen the field and say, let's get away from reifying nation and so on, where do we stop? How wide should our analytical range be?
So the most difficult question comes last, obviously. Fortunately, I don't have enough time to even attempt to answer it, but I think you're absolutely right, and I think that's where I'm kind of happy with this project that I mentioned in response to one of Sinisha's questions, which is this notion of the idea of the state, right? And I know it kind of goes back, well, why talk about this territorial state? But I think attitudes that people develop towards what we call the modern barbarian territorial state, whatever, I think they they influence the types of communities that you can end up talking about. So what if you have a bunch of people who are simply saying, well, this type of political organization is simply illegitimate, and we want to move beyond it, right? What do you call people, if there's enough of them, who have that stance towards the state? And I think that pushes us towards kind of contemplating different kinds of, again, to use a word that I think Siniša is not going to be happy with, identities, or simply narratives about oneself, right? Because ultimately we are collectives. It's just a question of what kinds of collectives we are. Ultimately, I think this book sort of embryonically points to this notion that the character of the collective depends on the attitude towards this master concept of modern politics, which is the state.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Well, thanks everyone for participating in this discussion. Thanks in particular to the 4 discussants who gave such thoughtful comments earlier. I think everyone can see from the quality of the discussion. This is an incredible book, and I think that's reflected not just in the quality of the comments, but also in the very range of comments that people have been provided. It's people coming from very different perspectives in terms of the conceptual frameworks that they use, very different methodologies, very different case studies that they're familiar with. So I think that's a testament to just how much there is in this book and how much it offers us in terms of thinking about these things differently. So the last thing to say really is congratulations to Karlo for generating this. There's a wonderful piece of work, and thank you for giving us the opportunity to be here today to discuss it.
Thank you so much, Ailsa. Thank you, everybody. It was great.